Welcome back to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and Patty Hadju is our guest. Patty, just this week, there was a report, and we're going to put this up on the screen, looking at the waiting list for affordable housing in Ontario. And we're seeing a rise over the last 10 years of about 30%. So that'd be like 3% a year. So housing is becoming more difficult for people to get. Shelterhouse deals with folks who aren't able to access that housing. You know, what do you do with that? How if the houses aren't there for people to move into from living on the streets into housing, where do you go, and what are the plans around that?
And that's where, you know, you kind of come full circle in our conversation, because we were talking earlier about the social determinants of health and housing being sort of a foundation of health. It's the rate of stays are much longer. So moving people out into affordable housing has become a much lengthier process, which then correspondingly results in longer shelter stays. If people are, you know, ill and they need other services, it's really hard to obtain those services when you're in a state of transition or, instability. And so what we see is the rising cost of sheltering. So Shelterhouse, for example, was custom built for 42 maximum spaces, emergency shelter beds. At the time, and one of the board members is sort of our unofficial historian, because he's been involved as a board member for over 20 years. At the time, the planning committee thought that'll be more than enough, because they were sheltering 20 people, maybe 30 people on a really cold night. And they thought 42 was going to take them well into the future. Well, the building was built in 2006. By 2009, they had to apply to increase the beds to 62. And when I started in August of 2012, we were nearly full in August. And apparently that was an unheard of phenomenon. And since I've been the ED, we've never dipped below full capacity.
Oh my gosh.
You know, I know that the DSAB has been tracking statistics, and shelters are operating somewhere around the 130% capacity between Salvation Army and us. So these are alarming statistics. You know, it's interesting because the housing portfolio sort of falls at a number of levels in terms of government responsibility, but ultimately it is the federal government's responsibility, and there hasn't been a significant investment in affordable housing for many, many, many decades, one would argue. You know, since the 1980s, I know is sort of a time frame that's been bandied about. And I think it's time for us, I think, as Canadians and as citizens, to ensure that that the call for affordable housing is as loud as possible, because it isn't just inhumane. It's extremely expensive to support someone in an emergency sort of status. The Calgary Homelessness Foundation did a study way back, I think, 2011, and found that the cost of supporting someone on the streets in an emergency type of setting is somewhere in the range of $130,000 a year.
$130,000 a year.
And that
what could we, get for $130,000 on the open market?
Well, just for comparison's purpose, I mean, the managed alcohol program, which is a specialized program that Shelterhouse offers for people who have been significantly homeless, so homeless for at least a decade, and severe chronic problems with alcohol. That program, which is staffed 24 hours a day with 2 staff, is about $31,000 a year. And that's a highly intensive supportive living scenario. So you could imagine that even for people that maybe just need like a weekly check-in or, a little bit of case management, it would be, significantly less expensive. And so this reluctance to invest in those social determinants of health, and this is why we're full circle here, creates a burden on the province, creates a burden on municipalities, and of course creates a burden on the individuals who are suffering through the lack of resources for folks that are living in poverty with severe issues sometimes.
And now this same article, I think it was in the Toronto Star a couple days ago, links as well changes really in our economy, that we're moving to a lot of the jobs that are created now are part-time, temporary work, precarious work, that people have a hard time, they're working, have a hard time to be able to pay for housing as the prices of housing are going up. And in a way, you're there supposed to be catching all these problems that are created by a much bigger system. Where can we go with that?
Well, I think that's why we need, we need to really continually draw attention to the evidence, and that's why, I'm glad that there's a federal election coming up, because I think, I think there are calls for a return to evidence-based decision making. Because if we know the evidence is clear that we're going to spend as a society, 10 times as much by supporting people in a sort of an emergency sort of way versus what would happen if we invested in affordable housing. Housing is a foundation. You ask me and I say, well, what comes first? Well, I actually think housing is a foundation.
Yeah.
Because how do you move on even from, how do you even get a job if you don't have an address, if you don't have a phone number, if you don't have a place to keep your stuff that's safe, that's not going to get stolen, that you have a regular access to a washing machine, that you have access to a place to rest that's not interrupted by the snoring of 26 other men. I mean, there are all kinds of practical problems with being employed and being homeless. And so without that foundation of a stable place, a secure and safe place, it's really hard for people to move forward in their lives. So I think as citizens, we need to be really engaged in this policy development process. And we can do that by supporting people that are talking about sensible policy.
Well, we're running out of time, Patty. I want to keep this conversation going, and once again, I want to invite our viewers to join us in this conversation. We did actually get our first post of someone on our Facebook page that asked a question. So I'm going to give you 15 seconds to answer this one. How can the community best help Shelterhouse continue to be a success?
There's two ways. One is make sure you know who you're voting for in this municipal election. You can read between the lines, and people are being very clear about how they feel about things like harm reduction and shelter and poverty. So be very careful about who you vote for. And the second thing is that you can donate. You can always donate, and any amount we gratefully receive. You can donate online. You can give us a call. Money is the best donation, just because then we can use it to pay the salaries of our employees. But we also gratefully accept food. We serve over 250,000 meals a year, 2 hot meals a day. People rely on our service to feed themselves. And so you can also volunteer to help prepare those meals. 50,000 hours of volunteer time goes into running Shelterhouse. So there's a number of ways that people can support us.
And so really the community really is actively supporting Shelterhouse. It's one of the things I feel so good about living here in Northwest Ontario, that people really do care. And they do want to make a difference, and they're showing that, I think, at Shelterhouse. So once again, go to our Facebook page. If you have a comment, if you have a question, we'll probably try to engage Patty too in that conversation on the Facebook page. Our next show will be having a guest from the Bay Credit Union Social Responsibility Committee. And this is an idea that is being promoted by the Bay Credit Union to see how corporations in our local community can actually engage in a more constructive way in the community that they serve. Once again, on Facebook, it's Community Conversations. Thank you very much for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you again next week.
That's what we all gotta say.